You think modern cooking has improved on everything our grandparents made? Think again. Somewhere between convenience culture and fast food takeover, we abandoned dishes that carried real flavor, tradition, and pure satisfaction. Here are 60 old school dishes we stupidly stopped making and deeply regret losing. Corned beef hash was a real silver lining for most people to look forward to. While corned beef itself came out of Ireland, it got to the US by the 19th century, but by the middle of the 20th, it was obvious that this Irish invention had made a very American home for itself. Lots of big-name corporations also helped spread the hype around, typically Hormel's. They were the most affordable ones to get, and they were also the best quality for a few reasons. That shelf life was really nothing to scoff at, and it was a pretty hefty serving of beef in a very transportable can. Corned beef has such a rich history throughout the 20th century. In the 1960s, it was a fast way to get mashed potatoes, vegetables, and a protein on your plate and chow down. Just 20 to 30 years before that, it was actually one of the biggest things you needed to make sure you had because it was a big part of most people's very frugal daily diet. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier. Pan frying with a touch of vinegar was one of those small but effective tricks that made a big difference in flavor. When frying ground beef, a splash of vinegar cut through the grease and brightened the overall taste. It kept the dish from feeling too heavy and added a subtle tang that balanced the richness of the meat. This trick was particularly useful for skillet meals or gravies, where the beef could easily overwhelm the other flavors. The vinegar acted as a secret seasoning, lifting the dish without anyone realizing what had been added. It was also a way to tenderize the meat slightly, making it more enjoyable to eat. Families didn't question why the beef tasted better, they just knew it did. Today, we think of vinegar mostly as a salad ingredient, but back then, it had a place in everyday cooking as well. This was one of those clever touches that showed Grandma's instinct for flavor, proof that she didn't need fancy spices or complex recipes to elevate a meal. All it took was a splash of something simple to turn an ordinary pan of beef into something unexpectedly memorable. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like Apple Betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, But the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. So, that vegetarian chili I was just talking about. Yes, it was its own kind of thing, and yes, it flopped kind of how you would expect it to. I won't say it flopped entirely, since it really did find a place for itself, unlike Spam fried rice and a niche fan base to call family. Unfortunately, that niche fan base and the overall population of the country have both moved on from chili in general. In the South, if you described vegetarian chili to anyone, they'd probably giggle or tell you to eat something real. In urban places like upscale neighborhoods in New York, it was probably a fairly decent and affordable snack. I mean, it's not like this would really take a lot of effort from anyone's side. All you had to do was dice up some cabbage, lettuce, onions, and peas and throw it in that chili, get a good mixing going, and you had a bowl ready. Unfortunately, as far as tastes and preferences go, both basic vegetables and chili have started to become used in many different ways. If people crave spice these days, they just go to an Indian restaurant. They don't waste their time with a chili bowl like people used to. The French also made a significant contribution to delicious casseroles with the easy shepherd's pie. It was a meaty casserole traditionally made with lamb meat. Shepherd's pie has its roots in British cuisine. The name shepherd's pie specifically refers to the use of lamb, while cottage pie is used when beef is the main ingredient. This one was an easy one to make as it didn't require hours of preparation. The dish became popular in the UK during the 19th century, particularly after the introduction of potatoes in the late 18th century. This one was used for meal prep, as it was great for making ahead and freezing. It was known as hachis parmentier in French cuisine, but different countries came up with their own version of the shepherd's pie. In Australia and New Zealand, it's often called cottage pie, and in some places the dish includes sweet potatoes or other unique toppings. Pickled beet and goat cheese sandwiches were like pretty much the same thing as a lot of the recipes from the Depression era that you see persisting beyond the 50s. There's something that people back then acquired a taste for, but this combo really brought out the best of them too. Chèvre, or as we know it, goat cheese, was something that was actually not too popular in America though. It was something that French, Spanish, and Italian immigrants popularized, but it was something that was originally first introduced in America by European settlers. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, it was a niche thing. Not exactly the main character or a big part of the B-plot, but it was a good extra in the background, sometimes the foreground, know what I mean? Lots of small-scale farming and goat dairy farms did start to open up in places like Wisconsin, Oregon, California, and Vermont, and when the health scares started, the government only started pushing things like goat's cheese more. It wasn't a big stretch to move towards sandwiches then, and the beet and goat cheese combo was already something that worked. In today's day and age, this sandwich just isn't flashy, substantial, or tasty enough to last though. But some people still keep it as a vegan-friendly option. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Slumgullion stew is an American dish that became known for how easy it was to prepare. I mean, seriously, you think of stews, and your mind immediately goes to all the hard work and blood and sweat that goes into making a proper one, especially if you're cooking for a decently sized group. Some of these stews could get real costly too, but not slumgullion, no. This dish was a comfort food recipe that had been twisted, diluted, and transformed in so many ways across the decades, but still always managed to retain what made it work. That's very rare for most recipes, as they often lose their original essence in translation from one era to another. A slumgullion stew typically looks like lots of beef, macaroni, greens like canned tomatoes, corn, and beans. And they would also throw in chili beans and vegetable soups to add to the broth. By the 1960s, suburban living had become the norm, and a family diner was what most people were buying their groceries for. Slumgullion stew was a mouthful to eat and say, so it worked really well. Using tomato soup as sauce was one of Grandma's simplest but most dependable shortcuts for flavor. With a single can of condensed tomato soup, she could take plain ground beef and transform it into a meal that was hearty, tangy, and comforting. The soup added moisture, preventing casseroles, skillet suppers, or even simple beef and rice dishes from becoming dry or bland. Its sweet, slightly tart taste gave the meal a richness that stuck in memory, tying dishes to the familiar red and white cans stacked in cupboards across America. Families grew up with that signature flavor, recognizing it immediately as the taste of comfort. For Grandma, it wasn't about cutting corners, but about using what she had wisely, and tomato soup was a pantry item that always delivered. With one can and a pound of beef, she could have a hot dinner ready that satisfied everyone at the table. Today, the trick feels nostalgic, but back then it was a piece of kitchen magic built out of practicality and care. Go to the Midwest, roam Detroit and Chicago, and for a few blocks or neighborhoods you'll find lots of Chinese food, but out of all that, what will really stick in your head is egg drop soup. The cultural movement of Chinatown's Chinese food and a general dip into Asian cuisine was something that was primarily contained on both the East and West coasts, but it was also popular in the Midwest. Now, if you actually did live on the coasts during all of this, then you definitely know what I'm talking about. San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle, every major urban hub had a pretty large population of Chinese Americans, and egg drop soup was a pretty key item on the menu. These cities were really nice centers for people to try out Chinese food, especially because you could get the authentic stuff from immigrants who were working in restaurants. It was a big way of introducing the American population to more cuisines outside of their own, and I dare say they liked it enough to make it a mainstay. Plus, even if you go to the East Coast or the Northeast in places like New York or Boston, the trend of American food mixing with Chinese techniques and recipes was rising so much that it was hard to believe these were the same people who didn't know a thing beyond chow mein just a few years ago. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Scrapple is pretty common in Pennsylvania even today, but it started in the 1930s as a mush of pork trimmings with cornmeal or buckwheat and some minimal spices. Since people had limited options for their culinary ventures, most scrapple were not as tasty as they could have been. That does not mean it lacked a kick, though, as most people found that even for trimmings, it worked pretty amazingly overall. People would regularly make it a habit to ask their butcher to save any scraps that were left over or unused because they had some scrapple in mind for today's menu. Especially in the Mid-Atlantic in places like Virginia, Delaware, Washington, and South Jersey. People would use offal too and make a broth out of the bones, though in the end any bones and fat were taken out of the dish. Now, as far as cold and chilled dishes go, a salad is something people can cope with, but cold roasted beef with horseradish sauce? By God, it's almost blasphemy. Really? Cold beef? You ever heard of that? It was a shock to me too. I think most of us have just grown up assuming all meat-related dishes are supposed to be served hot by default, It was these thin slices of roast beef that were packed in a dipping sauce, but it was still something to get used to. Now, I'm not really sure what the idea was behind this. I guess it is true that microwaves weren't exactly a function of everyone's homes, and lots of sandwiches would just go cold. If you eat enough of those, it can definitely develop into like a habit, but to have this as a preference? Chat, I'm just not sure how I feel about this one. What would you guys think? If you give it a yes, I'm taking this to work tomorrow, so just think with caution, okay? That lunch break is really important. So, squash might not be our top pick on a regular day, but Grandma's squash casserole was so irresistible that we found ourselves going back for seconds, or even thirds. This casserole was a staple in Southern cuisine and was Graham's favorite way of sneaking nutrients into our dinner. Squash is rich in vitamins A and C, potassium and fiber, making it a wholesome choice. Now, this dish was typically famous in the summer when squash was available in abundance, but you could freeze the veggie and enjoy it all year round too. Squash casserole was highly customizable, meaning Graham could tweak it by adding cooked bacon, sausage, or even fresh herbs. The secret ingredient that gave this bad boy its unique taste was a dash of hot sauce, so next time you attempt making this dish for a potluck, don't forget the key ingredient. Thank me later! Shredded pork tacos, on the other hand, are still something that I can confidently say has kept up with the local scene. Do you know how many gaming sessions, yap-offs, and movie nights have been spent preparing, assembling, and binging no tacos? I mean, it evolved from a street food to a party snack to a regular daily part of our lives. You just can't separate America from its tacos anymore, but does that mean there's equity? Is the socio-political state of the taco world a hierarchy where others sit at the top and some get to be stuck at the bottom ladder, forever lost to time? Or is it a spectrum where we all happily enjoy every variation of taco ever and just decide where we want to go on the spectrum to get what we enjoy? Unfortunately, the truth is a mix of both. Now see, lots of tacos have come and gone. That's no secret. Some had a lot more pull than others, and some were a lot more palatable to mass tastes. Shredded pork tacos were something that were really just a showstopper for the taco scene in general. Before this, you had your usual assortment of chicken bites, pinto beans, sour cream, and some veggies. But no one was really delving into pork territory. Did it last all the way to the big 2025, though? I can't say it did. I just don't see enough shredded pork tacos anymore out in the street to count them as being popular, especially in this day and age where the meaning of the words trendy and popular continue to evolve every day thanks to social media. Making a gravy base from beef drippings was one of the most practical and delicious habits Grandma swore by. After frying ground beef, she never just poured off the pan juices, they were too valuable to waste. Instead, she whisked in flour, maybe a splash of broth or milk, and built a flavorful gravy that could be ladled over mashed potatoes, bread, or noodles. This simple act turned a basic skillet of beef into a complete, comforting meal that stretched to feed more mouths. It gave dinners depth and warmth, making even small portions feel satisfying. Families relied on this trick not only because it saved money, but because it created flavor from what others might have discarded. The aroma of that sizzling gravy filled kitchens and promised a meal that was both hearty and resourceful. These days, we're often told to drain and discard fat for health reasons, but back then, every drop was an opportunity. That was the beauty of Grandma's cooking, knowing how to turn scraps into something rich, flavorful, and worth remembering long after the plates were cleared. Stuffed celery sticks are one of the nicest appetizers you can actually get. Despite what you may have originally thought, there's more use for a celery stalk than you could imagine. All you need to do is get yourself accustomed and familiar to the wonderful world of fillings. I'm talking about cheese spreads, jams, chili fillings, and peanut butter. If it can hold itself inside of a celery, it can work. Besides, people wouldn't just stick to these ready-made fillings. They'd try to look for things they could make on their own too. Making your own fillings for dishes like stuffed celery sticks was really common. After all, people were finally getting back into home cooking and how much they really enjoyed it. Stuffed celery sticks are actually some of the healthiest meals to eat too, because they take advantage of a trend that started off early in the 20th century and use it to make an otherwise boring vegetable the talk of the whole table. Stuffing vegetables started somewhere between the 1920s and 1930s as a way to make a dish heavier so that you would go longer between meals. Luckily, it stuck around once people saw the crazy appeal. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. Now, this might be an odd pairing to a lot of you, but peanut butter and bacon sandwiches really did hit. Hey, some of you who are 90s kids might even remember. This was basically one of the best lunches you could get, and to be honest, I still think a lot of people do make this even if it's not as popular as it used to be. It was just a flawless idea in concept and execution. Take 2 slices of bread, a dash of peanut butter, and some perfectly well-fried strips of bacon. It's genius. Throw in some iceberg mayo and whatever else it is you like and whatever keeps you going throughout that miserable shift, and you have yourself a full-sized snack and meal. This was basically the reason why this dish got so popular. You could even make 2 of these and still make your daily subway or bus ride if you were living in crowded urban centers. Plus, there was just so much room for variety with a dish like this that a lot of people didn't see the point in changing it up. However, that coffee work culture thing I was talking about is unfortunately a real phenomenon. Somewhere along the line, people really started to abandon the idea of having a solid meal at all for lunch, and I think you only see older workers who were raised in the 20th century still having things like this. Now, I'll tell you what worked in the South and everywhere else. Fried bologna sandwiches. Hey, even the vegans had to reconsider. If you can't beat them, join them, right? No, seriously, these sandwiches were just that good. I don't know if they made bologna better back in the day or if they just laced it with magic drugs, but people were addicted, and I mean bad. This was the working class meal, especially in rural areas. Bologna wasn't only just delicious, it was also insanely affordable and one of the easiest meat products you could ever hope to get. In a post-war America where meat prices still hadn't fully recovered and become what they used to be, bologna sandwiches were more or less a godsend for everyone in the country. A budget-friendly meal before your long, grueling shift with a dash of protein to save your day and nutritional needs. Frying the bologna was also something people deeply took to because of how much flair it would add overall. A simple slice of bologna and some bread slices became the saving grace of many people's days back in the 70s. Mixing in oats instead of breadcrumbs was one of Grandma's thriftiest and most reliable tricks, and it worked better than most of us realize. Rolled oats blended right into ground beef without taking away from its flavor, and because they absorbed juices, the beef stayed moist instead of drying out. Oats also gave meatloaf and patties a lighter texture that felt more filling, which mattered when you were trying to stretch a single pound to feed an entire table. For families who grew up in leaner times, this clever substitution was about more than thrift. It was about making meals last. Oats were affordable, always in the pantry, and easy to work with, which made them the perfect stand-in when breadcrumbs weren't available. The beauty of this trick is how seamlessly it fit into daily cooking. Most people couldn't even tell oats were hidden inside. Today, it's often overlooked because modern recipes default to breadcrumbs. But in truth, oats gave those classic dishes their old-fashioned heartiness. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about getting the most out of what you had and never letting an ingredient go to waste, which was the very spirit of Grandma's kitchen. Hamburger pie was actually an immensely popular recipe that was widespread throughout America during much of the 1960s. It was a big part of the culture that was enveloping the whole country, which was the idea of making convenient and easy meals that were also light on the budget. The 1960s was a time of casseroles, one-pot meals, and buying canned and pre-packaged food because of how much the workforce had become active after the disastrous first half. The hamburger pie was right up the American people's alley because it was a really good all-rounder that you could whip out for a number of reasons. Family dinner, me time on Saturday, or just a celebration at your household. People could also serve it with all kinds of sides too, and despite how there was a focus on making your food easier to prepare, people were pigging out. Could you blame them? It had been a while since most Americans could reliably wake up to their favorite foods. This dish offered you the familiarity of a hamburger in the form of a pie, and those sides, such as mashed potatoes or collard greens, really helped to bring the entire picture together. You could even bake this into a casserole, and that's also a part of why it was so common in cookbooks and community recipe collections. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. We're going to take a bit of a deep dive into a cuisine that we haven't really explored before. I'm talking about caponata, which is a very traditional Sicilian dish that goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's supposed to be a sailor's dish. Can you believe that? It got that reputation attached to it because the birthplace of caponata was Sicily. There's no specific restaurant or name that's credited with making it, but if you ever went there, you'd know just how much the people appreciate this. The first time this became popular in America was when Mediterranean cuisine and Italian immigrants were mixing together and creating all sorts of new dishes, as well as bringing old familiar ones from their homeland. The best part about this dish for a lot of people was that it gave a chance to a vegetable, which otherwise people just aren't too fond of. I mean, eggplants aren't really the most main course-worthy idea you could think of, right? Pair that up with some tomatoes, onions, olives, and capers and cook it in vinegar, sugar, and olive oil. Make a nice little traditional agrodolce sauce, and you'll get this extremely earthy dish with a lot of complex flavors going for it. Stone soup is almost exactly what it sounds like, and it does involve a solid rock being in your soup. But hear us out, it is only temporary. Now, the origin of this term dates back to a European folktale about how two people would come into a town, convince everyone to share a bit of food, and then make a meal for the entire town. Sharing is caring, right? Anyway, the actual technique concerning food is to heat a rock in a fire and then place it in a bowl of soup so that it can cook it. People would add meat trimmings and scraps, plus carrots and cabbage to the soup to give it more nutritional value as well as flavor, and it did more or less work. What the real magic was that it browned the soup, which is something that you could not get in most standard soups people prepared. It also added a much richer flavor overall that was to die for, and people started to adopt the technique as it made soup on a budget much better than normal. Wasn't this a wonderful nostalgic journey through our grandmother's favorite recipes? Give us a like, subscribe, and let's keep those memories alive. Chicken a la king and puff pastry was another little nugget of French culture and cuisine that served us pretty well. So the idea here this time was to stuff creamy chicken and mushrooms into one single pastry, and there would be lots of these individual pastries, each stuffed to the brim. By now, we're talking about somewhere along the 70s. America's always been a big fan of cream. There's really no denying that, but I would say that we've warmed up to mushrooms a lot more than we used to. I don't think they were not popular, but they weren't exactly a standout ingredient that would be making anyone's top 10 or top 5 either. Americans were changing their palates regarding mushrooms thanks to two things, though. One, they had built up a fondness for it thanks to how many Americans, especially ones living on the edges of urban hubs, relied on foraging wild mushrooms. Two, things like cream soups, such as cream of mushroom soups, were already making the pairing of cream and mushrooms popular. This take on puff pastry wasn't exactly a long shot, since the stage was pretty much mostly set. However, I think most people have opted for things like sandwiches and ordering takeout at lunch now, or just getting a coffee. Work culture's really changed, and having a full-fledged meal during your 15-minute break isn't the most appealing option to a lot of people nowadays. You can't possibly reminisce about Grandma's forgotten casseroles without bringing up the ham and potato casserole. This one combined two classic comfort foods, ham and potatoes, and instantly became a favorite on the dining table. You know all those leftover ham that goes bad in your refrigerator after the holidays? Well, this recipe was a way to spice it up and turn it into something new, and of course, Grandma did it best. There was even a healthier version of the ham and potato casserole that was made using lean ham, low-fat dairy products, and extra vegetables to boost the nutritional content. Grandma used whatever potatoes she could find at the farmer's market, but this one could be made by a variety. Some recipes called for russets, while others used Yukon Gold or red potatoes, depending on your texture preference. Vegetarian chili definitely had its heyday in the same time as those moments I was talking about. Listen, when I say movement, I don't mean a 3-day bandwagon full of peaceful sit-ins and protests like we have today. I mean, like nationally, parents everywhere were livid. They couldn't stand that their kids were actually preferring to stay inside with a McDonald's Happy Meal and the television screen, and lots of them became super proactive about their family's diet and eating habits because of the massive revamp in culture. I mean, in this same century, these people went from surviving off of foraging wild mushrooms to watching moving pictures on a screen, having a magic box that just cools all their food full-time, slow cookers, the internet, computers, and God knows what else. All this to say, it was a fast-paced era, and people reacted with what they knew worked: vegetables. If the Depression proved anything, it was that there was a massive problem with people's diets. It wasn't economical, and it definitely wasn't healthy, and the alternative wasn't as impossible to switch to as most people would have you believe. Circumstances like this saw the rise of vegetarian chili in vegan cookbooks, but unfortunately, it couldn't make the cut, especially in the South, where people just outright rejected it. Shaping beef into steaks was one of those clever illusions that made dinners feel fancier than they really were. With a bit of seasoning and careful shaping, Grandma could take plain ground beef and press it into oval patties that looked like individual cuts of steak. Once browned in a skillet and topped with gravy or onions, they gave the impression of a hearty, steakhouse-style meal without the cost of real steak. For families who couldn't often afford higher cuts of meat, this trick was a way to enjoy the feeling of indulgence without breaking the budget. Kids grew up thinking they were eating something special, and in a way, they were. The special part was how much love and creativity went into making dinner stretch. The technique wasn't complicated, but it carried a sense of pride in serving meals that looked more extravagant than they were. Today we call it Salisbury steak or hamburger steak, but the heart of it is the same, turning ground beef into something greater than the sum of its parts. It was resourcefulness wrapped in flavor, and it left memories stronger than the meat itself. American-type goulash became a comfort food that was known for so many things that made your life easy. Simplicity, typically, was what people wanted during this time. Think about it. Work culture has only gotten worse in our generation. You come home clocking that 9-to-5 shift? What's the first thing that goes in your head? Maybe hop in the kitchen, thaw some chicken, and dirty your hands with some spices and grease? Come on, dude, no. You want to catch up on some Z's. Take a power nap. Get some of your pep back, you know? American goulash was such a good dish exactly because it let you do all of these things while still having a full stomach. In some places, you'd call it chop suey, but really, depending on the region you were in, you would see something entirely different. Some people had the whole thing consisting of this rich tomato sauce with diced and boiled tomatoes to go with it. Others really thought you couldn't make it work without a big focus on ground beef. This was the most popular option since, out of everything, ground beef being the center of the dish made it both affordable and familiar. Then, some people also really liked elbow macaroni. It was a pretty common sight to see in American goulash. The dish tasted very homely, and you could feed a family of 5 or more with one batch. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. So this is a bit of a tricky name to pronounce even when you give it a genuine try, but it's worth knowing about this dish because of how good it is. Ballymaloe Irish lamb stew is something that comes all the way from County Cork, and lamb stew is something that Americans welcome with very open arms. You can particularly find this dish being spread in droves around St. Patrick's Day in any Irish-American community. Whether you're in New Hampshire or Rhode Island, which even today have a pretty solid amount of Irishmen living in them, you're bound to run into a Ballymaloe stew once in a while. Despite how good of a stew it is, with tender carrots, potatoes, and tender strips of lamb, and how simple the preparation is since it relies mostly on the natural flavors present in the ingredients, this dish actually flopped once before. Well, I wouldn't say it was a true flop, but it did fade out of the memory of the general public before too. That was before the 20th century, but ever since then it has been seeing a bit of a revival thanks to social media and Ballymaloe House, which is what it's named after. Either way, this is one of the best recipes to ever come out of a family cookbook. And if you've ever had one while at an Irish friend's home, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. Bologna and cheese stackers were pretty much the ideal American breakfast, something that carried the spirit of our nation as well as all the flavors we've grown to love. Sliced bologna would be layered with cheese from the finest wheels in all of the United States of America. It would be packed in wax paper too, which was a funny little trick, but I'll explain why it was so popular. See, the thing about wax paper is that it traps moisture and flavor in, and that means your stackers stay perfectly fine just the way they were after you first made them. Bologna was always something we've had a deep appreciation for, and this stacker variant just proved that no matter how much the landscape of American cuisine changes, some habits die hard, and some just don't die at all. Not only was it just a good thing to eat before or after work, it was the perfect lunch to carry in a box with you. Plus, by the end of the 20th century, most offices had microwaves too, and you could always just find slices of bologna for cheap at most convenience stores. It was this kind of low-effort, easy-to-source and assemble style of cooking that would overtake America soon enough, and I think that's a part of why a lot of us prefer a latte instead of a sandwich now, ironically enough. Green bean casserole started out as a traditional Thanksgiving meal, but because of how much everyone loved it, it soon became a year-round delicacy. This one was also created as a creative way to market Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. When canned soups first hit the food aisle at grocery stores, many people were skeptical about them. Introducing new recipes was a way of encouraging people to add them to their daily meals, and Grandma really followed through with this one. The original recipe, known as the green bean bake, was developed by Dorcas Riley, a home economist at Campbell's. It combined green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and fried onions, and it was published in the company's recipe booklet. Our sweet old grandmas decided to make this one better by adding their own twists to the original recipe. Although traditionally rich and creamy, there were lighter versions of green bean casserole that used lower fat ingredients or alternative toppings to make it healthier. If we go back to the 1970s, we're going to discover another really popular dessert, which is rice pudding. Now, far be it from me to disrespect one of the greats. Rice pudding has been around far longer than I have, after all. Still, what's true is sadly still true. The days of glory for rice pudding are definitely far away in the past now. Dude, seriously, back in the 70s, this was all people ate for dessert. How could they not? 1, it was stupid easy to make, and 2, it was really convenient and sweet. All you needed was some cheap rice and milk, and that wasn't really breaking anyone's bank account or putting their budget out of order for the month. What you would get was this perfect dessert supper hybrid that would make perfect sense to have after a big meal or even in the cold winter months. I mean, it was definitely a lot more affordable than ordering a tub of ice cream and a lot healthier too. People have unfortunately started to head in different directions with rice though. These days, if people do eat it, it's mostly with things like chicken tikka masala or rice bowls like katsu curry. Not really any room left in the current climate for a rice-based dessert. Stretching with mashed potatoes was another clever way Grandma turned a little beef into a lot of dinner. Whenever there were leftovers sitting in the fridge, she didn't let them go unused. Instead, she folded the mashed potatoes directly into ground beef. The result was a creamy, hearty mixture that could be shaped into patties, baked into casseroles, or fried into crisp cakes that still tasted rich and filling. Potatoes not only extended the beef, but also added a silky texture that breadcrumbs or flour couldn't match. It was comfort food through and through, with a flavor that spoke to both frugality and warmth. Families who grew up on potato-stretched beef never forgot the way it felt to eat something so satisfying, even when times were lean. This wasn't a compromise. It was a form of creativity that made each bite taste more substantial. Instead of thinking about what was missing, you thought about how clever the dish was, how it filled the belly, and how Grandma always seemed to know how to make just enough food for everyone. These days, we often discard leftovers or reach for more meat, but the potato trick proves a pound could go further than you thought. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Meat turnovers in the 1960s were a really common choice of snack during the 1960s, and this is actually something we entirely have fast food culture and industrialization to thank for. The 1960s was a time when companies were slowly realizing the sheer goldmine that is convenience food. Canned food was just the start, the gateway drug, if you would. The next step would be to go on over to frozen foods, which is exactly where you would find most of the stuff for a meat turnover anyway. The rise of frozen beef, pork, chicken, and sausages, all of it meant that you could now have ease of access to meat dishes like literally never before. The best fillings throughout most homes were things like beef stew fillings or lots of diced sausages, often drenched in a spicy gravy or cheese mix. Beef turnovers were some of the nicest ones to come out of it, really. You would wrap all these frozen meats into one flaky pastry, and that was that. There were all kinds of options for it too. You could get Stauffer's, Banquet, and Callender's, all of which even started pulling out their own frozen turnovers. It was a cash cow, one after the next, and no company was not taking advantage of it. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. The phrase mock crab salad sandwich might invoke images of cheap sandwiches that were built to just look like a crab sandwich, but if I've earned your trust at all so far, then keep an open mind because this is actually a wonderful example of American ingenuity. So, mock food came out as a result of the Depression. Most people just couldn't really afford things like crab or red meat or any kind of meat, really. I mean, with the war rationing and everything, you pretty much had what you could hunt in the wild and the cheap cuts of meat that no one would really buy. Mock food was a way for people to get some flavors they were sorely missing. It stayed a long while even after the Depression, since thanks to urbanization, there were less and less coastal cities, bodies of water, and more. Otherwise, there used to be a time where crab was so abundant that it was cheap. Anyway, for this mock food imitation, what people would do is use cod or haddock instead, and the salad was just a basic mayo-celery mix with French or vinegar dressing. You'd lay that on some soft rolls, and you'd actually have a pretty good dish. The thing is, mock food culture is entirely a thing of the past now, and most of these recipes have been lost. Bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously, and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then, and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, and despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread, and sure, it was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? So with fish sticks and tartar sauce, the thing is, it really is a good dish. I have to give credit where it's due. It can hold its own in a number of situations. It's also the perfect kind of thing for more casual dinners, hangouts, and get-togethers too. That kind of also starts to make you wonder why something like this isn't really that popular anymore though, right? Well, I think, honestly, the trends have just changed. Fish sticks were once something that even people outside of coastal cities really enjoyed because they were almost the perfect mid-hangout food. Also, tartar sauce was hard to beat as a dip with fish sticks. They just brought out the best in each other. Now let's say you're mid-conversation during a Lakers game with your main man, and you don't feel like going to the trouble of spending an hour in the kitchen getting something ready to eat. That's totally cool. We've all been there. Let's say you're having a lazy Sunday with the wife at home and you both just can't be bothered. A perfectly normal situation to have fish sticks in. But these days, people just order stir-fry. Adding grated carrots or zucchini into ground beef was a quiet, clever trick that served multiple purposes in Grandma's kitchen. It wasn't only about making the beef stretch further, though that was a big part of it. It was also about slipping in extra nutrition without anyone noticing. Carrots added a natural sweetness that balanced savory flavors, while zucchini added moisture that kept burgers, meatloaf, or casseroles from drying out. Grating the vegetables fine meant they disappeared right into the beef, and kids usually had no idea they were eating vegetables at all. In a time when every ingredient had to be used wisely, this method made sense because it extended protein portions and made meals healthier at the same time. It also gave the beef more body and volume, turning one meal into two without anyone feeling shortchanged. This trick carried a sense of care, because Grandma knew how to make meals nourishing as well as filling. Today, with rising costs and an emphasis on hidden veggies, this old idea feels surprisingly modern. It's a reminder that cleverness in cooking was never about fancy ingredients, but about small adjustments that turned the ordinary into something bigger and better than expected. So, I talked a lot about how potlucks were basically this little nice family thing where people would get their picnic on and bring all kinds of dishes to the whole thing. It was a nice little event, you know? One of the traditions that came out of that was the potluck mystery dish. For this, basically, suspense was the name of the game. Each potluck would involve one specific person who would be in charge of bringing the mystery dish. So, usually there would be some kind of coordination or pre-planning. People would talk to each other. Dave would ask Jack if he was bringing the ribs, and Sarah would ask Caitlin if she was bringing the fried fish fingers, that sort of thing. Here, though, nobody had any clue. The best part? It was entirely up to the chef what the mystery dish would even be. Dishes were always prepared using pantry staples, and no one was bringing in something like a casserole, so you'd actually get all kinds of wild cards from this. Sometimes you'd get a Jell-O sandwich or a gingerbread stuffed with cheese or an entirely new kind of stew. Sometimes people would play into the unpredictability and bring in an old classic knowing that a simple answer wouldn't be what people were expecting. No matter what the case, it was pretty fun. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies, and this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Scrapple is pretty common in Pennsylvania even today, but it started in the 1930s as a mush of pork trimmings with cornmeal or buckwheat and some minimal spices. Since people had limited options for their culinary ventures, most scrapple were not as tasty as they could have been. That does not mean it lacked a kick, though, as most people found that even for trimmings, it worked pretty amazingly overall. People would regularly make it a habit to ask their butcher to save any scraps that were left over or unused because they had some scrapple in mind for today's menu. Especially in the Mid-Atlantic in places like Virginia, Delaware, Washington, and South Jersey. People would use offal too and make a broth out of the bones, though in the end any bones and fat were taken out of the dish. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier. Lettuce cups and shrimp salads were pretty funny. I mean, not exactly funny, but interesting. The assembly was something you would need skill for, though, which isn't at all similar to things like peanut butter and bacon sandwiches or corned beef and cabbage wraps. Leaves had to be carefully plucked from the head of the lettuce, and these would end up forming the shape of the cups. You would then spoon the cups with fillings, which were typically things like spices, vegetables, and stir-fried ground meat, but this instance of the dish has shrimp salad instead. Why was something like this popular? Well, besides a lot of influence from Asian culture, such as Thai and Chinese wraps, they were just easy. I mean, sure, you had to get used to making a lettuce cup, but that wasn't really the hardest thing to do. What was absolutely outstanding about these was the presentation. The sheer visual appeal that this dish had wasn't something you could ever compete with, honestly. I mean, a flowery-looking cup made out of lettuce leaves? That's artistic. Plus, the vibrant and colorful fillings inside would just make it pop off even more. As far as food goes, this one was definitely a slay. The once you did get one made, then you would simply have to prepare it by heating it up. They weren't really as good for lunch at work as they were for finger foods and a pretty-looking side or appetizer at a party, though. Speaking of veggie casseroles, the cabbage roll casserole was another hit on the dinner table. Don't we all love some good old-fashioned cabbage rolls? Well, this recipe took the labor-intensive meal and turned it into something simpler while retaining all the delicious flavors. Now this casserole has its origins in Eastern European cuisine, where cabbage rolls are a staple. It was a combination of recipes found in countries like Poland, Russia, and Hungary. Cabbage casserole not only tasted delicious, but also provided many health benefits with every bite. Cabbage is a nutritious vegetable that's rich in vitamin C, so it's pretty much the same deal with chili con carne. It used to be known as chili with meat and was extremely popular in the 70s, but it ran out of luck. Despite how it was used to being known as the quintessential American comfort food, it was just something that stagnated. In Texas and the southwestern areas of the United States, it was arguably the most popular it had ever been. Canned chili brands such as Wolf and Hormel also made it really easy for people to make stuff like this, and you had every beginner-friendly recipe available in cookbooks all over libraries, magazines, shops, and just anywhere, really. Chili con carne, for these reasons, managed to stay pretty relevant despite entering the game fairly late. It evolved into a lot of different variations and styles because not everyone has the South's preference for diarrhea and inflamed mouths, but it was seen as healthy, or at least it had the potential to be. Vegetarians even started pushing their own plant-based substitutes for the meat elements in the dish instead. I think chili bowls and canned chili in general are just falling out, it seems like these days. People go for more tamer flavors. Using rice as a filler was one of the oldest and most dependable tricks for making ground beef go further. Grandma could take a single pound of beef and, with the addition of rice, stretch it into a whole pot of hearty food that filled every plate. Sometimes she used cooked rice, folding it in to bulk up casseroles and stews, while other times she used raw rice, letting it absorb juices as it cooked right alongside the beef. This was how porcupine meatballs became a household favorite, fluffy grains poking out from tender beef in a tomato-based sauce. It wasn't just about thrift, though. Rice added body, absorbed flavors beautifully, and made each bite feel substantial. In times when budgets were tight, this clever trick allowed families to keep eating beef dishes without breaking the bank. It was practical, resourceful, and tasted so good that no one felt they were missing out. Even now, the combination of beef and rice has a homey, comforting feel to it, reminding us of tables where nothing was wasted and meals always seemed to stretch just far enough to feed everyone gathered. Remember how we were just talking about the way people decided to sometimes mess around with their casseroles, switch out the ground beef and put in sausages instead? Yeah, they had a name for that too. It was called hot dog casserole. Like almost every casserole that made its claim to fame during the 1960s, this one had a heaping serving of pasta. Actually, elbow macaroni is something you'd see a lot more often with this one, mixed in between patches of gooey cheddar cheese and diced or cut-up sausages. It was actually a pretty economical dish, and that's why it got popular in areas where common ingredients weren't so readily available. Let's talk about personality, though. Do we take this over a hot dog? How do we feel about the casserolification of almost everything? I mean, before I told you this, your idea of a hot dog was probably just the typical street food dog you get in a bun. Then again, maybe this is an idea worth trying. If sausages can work in a hot pot, there's no reason they can't work in a casserole. What do you say? In what form do you think the hot dog shines through more? Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. Around the later half of the 20th century, there was this big public paranoia that had spread concerning health and the after effects of the way Americans had been eating. Thanks to all that rage, we got dishes like vegetable aspic cups. See, lots of Americans were coming home to an angry mom, a worried wife, or a dad who just kept saying he wouldn't pay for the doctor's fees when your eating habits would eventually circle back around to bite you. It kind of did set fear into people's hearts, especially since the arguments were so convincing. Who could deny that they were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's like addicts back then, or even now? That's why there was this newfound room for fusion food or experimental recipes like vegetable aspic cups. Before, you could tell somebody about vegetables that were set in these tomato-flavored gelatins, and they'd just laugh at you. A chilled salad on top of that? But thanks to how easy convenience food culture had made things, with how you could just buy gelatin and frozen veggies whenever you needed, this was actually a really solid and healthy work lunch option. Leftover turkey in the fridge? Consider it your lucky day because that used to call for Grandma's legendary turkey noodle casserole. This casserole made mornings after Thanksgiving something to look forward to. This was the go-to recipe for using up leftover turkey and noodles after Thanksgiving or Christmas. All Grandma had to do was mix in the ingredients and add a topping made from breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even fried onions. Like most of the casseroles on this list, this was also a one-dish wonder and didn't require much labor. And you know Gram used to be tired from making us a grand feast the night before, so this was an easy way to serve something delicious on the dining table without putting in too much effort. This was a kid-friendly meal that appealed to even the pickiest eaters. What's not to love about a creamy sauce and some noodles all drenched in cheese? Making stock with beef bones and scraps was a habit rooted in a no-waste philosophy that defined Grandma's cooking. Whenever bones or trimmings were left behind, they weren't discarded. They went into a pot with water, vegetables, and seasonings. Slowly simmered, they produced a rich, flavorful broth that became the base for soups, stews, or gravies. This was how every part of the animal was respected and used to its fullest. The stock added depth to meals, turning simple ingredients into something layered and comforting. Families may not have realized it at the time, but that broth was what gave soups their soul. It was economical too, as it stretched meals further without requiring new ingredients. Today, many people buy boxed stock, but the homemade version was a staple of kitchens that couldn't afford waste. It carried the aroma of patience, filling the house with warmth while it simmered away. The act of making stock wasn't just thrifty, it was symbolic of a time when resourcefulness shaped every meal. It ensured that nothing ever went unappreciated and that even scraps had the chance to bring nourishment and comfort back to the table. Scalloped corn is a strange one. It's a creamy casserole, but it takes all kinds of ingredients that you wouldn't ever see in a casserole. I'm talking about things like corn, milk, eggs, butter, and sometimes even actual scallops if you lived in nearby coastal cities throughout the Midwest. In terms of texture, it was honestly less like a casserole and more like a custard or pudding. I mean, the cheese was really the most casserole-esque part of the whole thing. By the way, when people use the word scalloped in reference to old dishes from the 60s or any other era, they mean a baked dish that typically tends to come with some kind of cream sauce. It may also have breadcrumbs, but you get the idea. Corn, I get. Look, the past 3 decades, corn and the American people have had a bond that goes beyond just being best friends. It was the only thing that was there for them throughout so many nightmarish situations. Still, eggs, milk, butter, what was the idea here? Anyway, would you try this? Or are you glad that this is one dish they left behind in the 60s? Bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously, and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then, and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, and despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread, and sure, it was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. The next thing we have on the list is salmon croquettes with creamed spinach. Now on paper, this sounds like just what you would need, right? It's salmon, so there's protein. It's creamed spinach, so you definitely have a side that's jam-packed with nutrition. I mean, it seems ideal, the kind of thing you'd always want to be eating at work. For a long time in the 80s, that was how it worked too. People, particularly those working office and desk jobs, were very fond of this kind of lunch. It was also the perfect change in flavors from what people were originally used to. However, this was probably even more reliant on advanced preparation than egg salad stuffed tomatoes. That just wouldn't work with the way so many people were re-entering the workforce in the second half of the 20th century. It basically meant that your wife would have to stay at home and do kitchen duties every day, and most wives were opting to go to work instead. Labor-intensive meals like this, as a result, just didn't last in the long haul. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Pasta primavera was something that was put into the American culinary scene thanks to one chef, Cirio Macchioni of Le Cirque, which is a restaurant in New York City, and a pretty recognizable one. That name may not mean much to you right now, but this was the brain that made pasta primavera a symbol of sophisticated upscale dining during the 1970s. The intent was to capitalize on the growing national interest in lighter food and foreign cuisines, and one of the first places Americans thought to look for inspiration was Europe, specifically French and Italian cuisines. Of course, the Italian immigrants who still vividly remembered their country's food and delicacies couldn't wait to jump on the opportunity. I mean, if you heard a title fight calling your name and you knew the opposition was a punk, wouldn't you go? And who was the opposition here? Beef jerky? The same meatloaf you've been having since the 50s? I think they all felt differently. It was something that even got too many cookbooks too. Nowadays, it's not a trendy restaurant dish, and you'd be hard-pressed to find places that were selling it as their main attraction. But it did still turn a lot of heads. Cheese and potatoes are like a match made in heaven, and Grandma's cheesy, scalloped potatoes was straight out of any cheese lover's dream. So this casserole tastes even better than it looked, and let me tell you, it looked finger-licking delicious. The term scalloped comes from the French word escalope, which originally referred to thin slices of meat. However, in the case of scalloped potatoes, it refers to the thinly sliced potatoes used in the dish. Many grandmas used old-fashioned methods to make their cheesy scalloped potatoes, including hand-slicing the potatoes thinly, layering them with love, and cooking them slowly. Some even added secret ingredients they swear by, like a dash of nutmeg, a hint of garlic, or even a sprinkle of paprika for added flavor. The best part about this one was its crispy crust, and I'm sure you remember fighting all your siblings for the bigger chunk of it. This dish wasn't only tasty, but was also practical. It was a one-pot wonder, meaning it could be cooked and served in the same dish, making cleanup a breeze. I'm sure Grandma loved that. Macaroni salad with ham cubes is a really nostalgic one. If you look at it from the lens of what was popular in the era at the time, then yeah, sure, macaroni salads were a perfect middle ground between healthier, leaner bowls of salads and the typical macaroni and cheese meals we were all used to. People thought they had to get started somewhere, and well, why not get it going with something you know you can stand? If you look at it historically, then macaroni salad actually goes all the way back to European dishes like pasta fredda, and in the early 20th century, let's say around the 20s and 30s, it was a really popular meal to have as a side dish. During the Depression, it became a staple because you could make so much of it in large batches and still get everyone fed and taken care of. Now, in the war era, the rise of convenience foods meant that mayonnaise and macaroni were getting even more popular and accessible than ever before. It was only natural that people would start adopting macaroni salads, but they needed something to go with it. Some oomph, you know? That definitely came from the smokiness of the ham cubes, which honestly bounced really well off of the macaroni. This salad was a typical lunch in factories, offices, and just about any kind of labor-intensive job you could imagine. It's just a bit sad that people have gone back to Kraft's mac and cheese boxes now, though. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like apple Bettys than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup, especially in the winters when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. Pickle roll-ups, on the other hand, were a wonderful party-time snack that became the star of two types of gatherings: cocktail parties and potlucks. See, in potlucks, it was really common for people to bring one of everything and just have a lot to eat for the family, but cocktail parties were an entirely different kind of beast. The post-World War II era in America was a strange one. It saw lots of cultural shifts and new trends that people couldn't have ever guessed would make some serious headway into the mainstream. Despite that, these parties that were pretty much just wine-tasting parties but with cocktails turned into little competitive nights where people would compare their finger foods and the host would try their damnedest to pick a menu that suits everyone's tastes. By the end of it, no one would really even get drunk. What they would get, though, is pretty tipsy. And you must not be a stranger to the need for snacking that arises when the drinks start hitting. Casual gatherings that were cocktail parties also saw a lot of use for pickle roll-ups, and as far as snacks went, this was a pretty good option for hosts who couldn't spend a lot of time doing prep work. Folding and cooked barley was another clever trick that turned ground beef into something heartier without costing more. Barley was cheap, filling, and had a nutty flavor that paired perfectly with beef. Once cooked and added to the meat, it absorbed juices and spices, stretching the mixture into larger portions. Families didn't just get more food, they got a meal that felt satisfying and rustic, with a chewy texture that stood out from plain beef alone. This was especially common during hard times when making meat last was a necessity. The grain gave the illusion of abundance and made sure no one left the table hungry. Barley also brought a wholesome quality, adding nutrition while keeping costs low. Today, barley has mostly been forgotten in beef dishes, but its role in old kitchens was vital. It showed that the best fillers weren't bland. They actually added flavor and substance that made meals taste richer. If we go back just a bit before the war and right towards the start and middle of the Depression, you'll find that chipped beef on toast was actually one of the most common things to eat, especially across working class and rural households. There were people who had their own farms and space to grow and raise their own cattle. They would often enjoy the best versions of these. Then the rest of the population would usually be working on much tougher and cheaper cuts of meat from unwanted parts of the animals, like the back or the shoulder. It meant that the quality of the meat was something you had to work around, typically by slow cooking it so you'd get some tenderness. Still, most people really just had bread to work with. The bread was also very prone to going stale, and the beef wasn't something you could use in decent or large amounts just because you were having a bad day. It was the Depression, you know? Everyone was collectively having a bad day. Chipped beef on toast was an easy way for people to spice up their bread just a little while still being able to eat a decent breakfast. Stone soup is almost exactly what it sounds like, and it does involve a solid rock being in your soup. But hear us out, it is only temporary. Now, the origin of this term dates back to a European folktale about how two people would come into a town, convince everyone to share a bit of food, and then make a meal for the entire town. Sharing is caring, right? Anyway, the actual technique concerning food is to heat a rock in a fire and then place it in a bowl of soup so that it can cook it. People would add meat trimmings and scraps, plus carrots and cabbage to the soup to give it more nutritional value as well as flavor, and it did more or less work. What the real magic was that it browned the soup, which is something that you could not get in most standard soups people prepared. It also added a much richer flavor overall that was to die for, and people started to adopt the technique as it made soup on a budget much better than normal. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? On the other hand, stuffed bell peppers were an American classic, especially in places like the South. The idea was really similar to the egg-stuffed salad tomatoes I was talking about. Even then, I told you how it's more or less like these bell peppers. The idea here this time was to hollow these peppers out and fill them in with things like rice, tomato sauce, and ground meat. They were also the perfect thing to take to work because you could carry them in just about anything. The more transportable something was, the better it would function as a work lunch. Stuffed bell peppers also had the extra effect of giving you a boost of energy, which was always really nice because desk jobs, as I'm sure all of you might be familiar with, can suck the soul out of you. The reason these were popular in the South is because it's arguably the home of stuffed peppers and all variants of them. Those people love their spice, man. While the southern states were enjoying Tex-Mex cuisine, the northern states were all about Italian flavors, and baked ziti was a staple on the dinner table. Now, even with its Italian roots, you wouldn't typically find this one in Italy. This casserole was created by grandmas who were Italian immigrants to the States and adapted traditional pasta dishes to suit the ingredients available in their new country. Baked ziti was pretty much the long-lost cousin of lasagna, with the classic version including ziti pasta, marinara sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella cheese. The ziti pasta used in the dish was tubular and smooth, which makes it ideal for holding onto the sauce and cheese. This one was a hit at Sunday dinners and had everyone coming back for seconds. So it's not like the 70s were just a period of bad eating, bombastic food, and a lot of good music. It was also the age of fusion food. Ramen stir-fry kind of comes out of this sort of environment. Seriously, people were doing nothing if not experimenting like mad scientists. They were mixing up every food and recipe known to man in an attempt to crack the code at finding the perfect next big thing. Ramen stir-fry, despite how bad people wanted it to live up to their expectations of the next big thing, could not be that, unfortunately. The idea was to take instant ramen noodles and mix them up with the usual assortment of vegetables you see in most stir-fries. And for a time, that worked, but it just wasn't really innovative enough. I mean, ramen on its own already had a decent amount of vegetables and non-meat-related toppings in the broth. The ramen stir-fry that was being made was sort of an attempt to mimic a vegetable-based pasta dish, but it was just okay. Like, nothing spectacular. People still make it for casual snacks and food, and that's pretty much how it was conceived back then, too. Frying leftover meatloaf as sandwich filler was one of Grandma's most clever ways to reinvent yesterday's dinner. She would slice cold meatloaf straight from the fridge, drop it into a hot skillet, and crisp it until the edges sizzled golden while the inside warmed through. Once tucked between bread, sometimes plain, sometimes toasted, it transformed into a hearty sandwich that felt brand new. A swipe of ketchup, mustard, or even leftover gravy turned it into a meal strong enough to rival anything from a diner. This trick meant leftovers never felt repetitive, and kids often had no idea they were eating yesterday's dinner. The crispy edges against soft bread made every bite memorable, the kind of flavor that stuck with you. For lunchboxes, it was a treat disguised as thrift, and many still recall the taste decades later. It was resourcefulness wrapped in comfort, proof that creativity made nothing feel wasted. Today, leftovers often get tossed aside, but back then they were opportunities. Grandma's frying trick showed that with just a little imagination, food could shine twice. Potato pancakes are a lot more cultural than you think. They're deeply rooted in European Jewish traditions, and even in American Jewish communities, you always find this in someone's fridge. They have some pretty strong links to the cuisine, but despite that, the 20th century was a time when America really became known for being a melting pot of different cultures. Before that, you could say that each place had its own identity, each state its own little corner of Uncle Sam's backyard, but now it really is all one big pot. In the United States, they're typically something most people link together with Hanukkah, but they're also a really big comfort food outside of that too. There's some practical history and some cultural Jewish history to this. So, practically speaking, during the Depression and wartime, people almost exclusively lived off of potatoes. Potato skins, potato soup, potato pancakes. I mean, it was one of the cheapest and easiest ways to get a pancake during then. From there on, it took off so well that most people just kept making them even after the dust settled. It was a pretty endearing exchange of traditions from one community to another. And to be honest, I think I like potato pancakes more than the original. What about you? Would you ever try a starchy variant of a typical American breakfast? Or are you booking it straight to IHOP? Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas, and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Ploughman's Lunch was this really traditional British cold meal, and I guess you'll find a lot of these on the list. The basic combo here was basically just bread, some pickles, chutneys, apples, and cheese. You'd also get chutneys, which I'm not sure what that's worth. The British never really made good ones anyway. Hey, I'm only kidding. It's quintessentially a European breakfast though, and over there it's even considered rustic. But over here, just like the previous item, this was considered pretty controversial. Now, most of the setup here was something any pure-blooded American could work with. You have your farmhouse loaves, some sourdough if that's not your type, or even multi-grain bread. We've eaten Subway on hungrier days with those same options, right? It was just the cold meat part that wouldn't vibe well with a lot of people. I mean, really though, what do you expect? This is the land of cookouts with grills, deep-fried chicken fillets, and melted gooey cheese on just about everything. Cold just doesn't fit anywhere in that picture. Cornbread and beans are another one that we unfortunately just left behind in the 70s. Healthy eating like that looks and sounds real good on paper. And don't get me wrong, people find ways to make it work in real life and practical application too. I mean, it didn't get to being such a popular staple crop for no reason, you know? Unfortunately, people tend to get tired of what they become too codependent on. Corn was abused so much as a crop during the 20th century, whether it was the massive amounts of overfarming for big-time canning companies or whether it was the massive amounts of corn that people were farming and putting to use during the Depression. Suffice it to say that cornbread definitely wasn't something people were waking up excited for, at least not well into the 2000s, when they were exposed to so many options from other cultures. Beans are still a regional favorite, and in the South, there's still a deep-found appreciation for cultural foods like black beans. They just don't really make the front of the cookbook anymore, you know? Binding with evaporated milk was one of those subtle secrets that most people never realized was happening behind the scenes. Canned milk was a pantry staple, always on hand when fresh milk couldn't be counted on, and Grandma knew exactly how to use it to improve ground beef. Adding just a splash into meatloaf or burger mixtures gave the beef a tenderness it wouldn't have otherwise. It softened the texture, made it more cohesive, and added a richness that made the dish taste like more than the sum of its parts. The slightly concentrated flavor of evaporated milk also enhanced seasonings, blending them through the meat in a way that felt balanced and smooth. For many households, it was an invisible step that made the difference between a dense, heavy loaf and one that cut easily and stayed moist. This was a time when nothing in the pantry went ignored, and canned milk was versatile enough to become a secret weapon in savory as well as sweet cooking. Today, we pass by evaporated milk without thinking, but in Grandma's kitchen, it was part of the quiet magic that made ground beef meals taste better than you remembered. Speaking of Southern cuisine creeping into other corners of the country, pimento cheese sandwiches are the quintessential Southie dish to talk about. As far as sandwiches go, they've pretty much nailed the formula. You have a taste you won't really forget thanks to the wonderful usage of pimento cheese, which is really just cheddar cheese mixed with small red peppers known as pimentos. Then, you have the sauces and vegetables. People like to keep it pretty simple, you know, nothing too fancy. They'd throw in some red onions, or normal ones, and cloves of garlic. Some cayenne pepper and jalapenos would make it even spicier, but some people really preferred their cheese sandwiches that way. I know that at least more than a few people really enjoyed doing it this way, up in the South. As far as sauces went, most people stuck to Worcestershire sauce for how it would really add some depth to the dish. The pimento cheese sandwich was one of the best things to come out of the South, because it was such an affordable and delicious meal to make. Pimento cheese wasn't really the hardest thing to get. If you lived near any kind of grocery store, then there was a pretty good chance they had it. Most people in the South also either grew their own peppers or had dedicated shops and spots for where they'd go. Everyone had their own favorites when it came to where they'd like to get their vegetables, so depending on the harvest, you'd also get some pretty different tastes. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. So you might notice that this issue where you need a lot of prep work for these dishes isn't exactly a unique one. Lots of dishes share it, and even cottage cheese and pineapple bowls have the same problem. Now, this dish was something that came out around the 60s and 70s, when Americans were really into trying out new things. One of the first things they opted for was pineapple, and this was thanks to Spam, which really made the American population warm up to an otherwise chronically detested fruit. This bowl was seen as healthy, full of protein, it was cold, and it could be prepared way ahead of time. The reason this lasted as long as it did was probably because of that, though only people that were super serious about their health and diet would be bringing this kind of stuff to the office. It wouldn't make sense to ignore the perfectly convenient, cheap, and delicious deli food on the corner of your office and go for a cottage cheese and pineapple bowl. Unfortunately, while this one has the convenience factor down, it couldn't last in the long haul because tastes have just changed too much from the days where bowls like this could work. Spam fried rice and the question of its immediate availability really are something that you would have to think about region to region. In Hawaii, in 2025, I guess, yeah, you could find places that were doing it or really just make it yourself with any cheap brand of Spam. Everywhere else, though? It hasn't been such a good century for pineapples, really. The anti-pineapple propaganda press has never eased up entirely, at least not since pineapple pizzas were the next big laughingstock of the internet in the 2010s. While the days of hating on things like that are far in the past too, the general divisiveness on pineapples and therefore Spam hasn't really gone. Spam fried rice struggles to find a place for itself among today's menus of vegan-friendly food. Fusion food from a mix of 3 different cuisines and cultures, fast food, convenience food, and all the other options that overwhelm our budgets and minds daily. In all of that, why look towards that lonely little can of Spam and a bag of rice? There are killer delis just down the corner, you know? And they deliver. Cooking with onion soup mix was one of those mid-century hacks that made its way into countless beef recipes, and for good reason. The packets were cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with onion flavor that instantly transformed ground beef. Grandma would sprinkle it into meatloaf, burgers, or casseroles, and suddenly the dish tasted like it had been seasoned all day. The dried onion flakes added texture, while the seasoning mix brought a savory depth that was hard to achieve with just salt and pepper. For busy households, it was a shortcut that never felt like cheating, because the results were always so satisfying. Families grew used to the rich flavor it gave their meals, and the convenience meant it became a pantry staple in many homes. Today, with so many seasoning blends on the shelves, onion soup mix feels almost quaint, but it was once revolutionary in its simplicity. It proved that with a single packet, a plain pound of beef could be turned into something memorable. This trick was less about being fancy and more about being clever, and that's exactly why it became one of Grandma's sworn-by secrets. In the 1960s, Beanie Weenies weren't some kind of cute wintertime trend with beanies or a Halloween candy. They were actually something you'd see in school cafeterias almost all of the time. Why? What is a Beanie Weenie? Well, despite what it sounds like, it's actually a pretty good mix of baked beans, hot dogs, and some ground beef. This meant that it was one of the most popular mixes for parents to make during times when they had to get to work, but their kid had to get to school faster. If you're one of those people who never finds enough time to make a breakfast from scratch in the morning for their little critter, I think you might still see the value in something like this. How did Beanie Weenies emerge, though? Well, between pop culture references in shows like The Simpsons and The Goldbergs, a list of stores in every area selling affordable canned versions of the ingredients, and Beanie Weenies in general sneaking into all aspects of American life, even the military, I'd say the dish has had many places to grow some really positive PR for itself. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Bacon. Crackers, I mean, sure, they're pretty good even as a typical easygoing breakfast, but what do we really do here? You eat something enough times, you tend to get used to it and get bored. How do you get around that? Well, since the topic is retro dishes, we used to hear a lot about bacon bow tie crackers back in the day. It was something you could find for breakfast or a cocktail appetizer, which is some serious versatility. The crackers were extra crispy since they were wrapped inside bacon and then baked until the bacon itself was pretty crispy. It was the perfect combo, and all they needed was each other to realize that. It was smoky but sweet. It was also savory, but buttery smooth and not dry at all. Dishes that are such neat little combinations like these are often hiding right under your nose, and if we didn't have the imagination of so many home chefs who found these and got them into the public sphere, then we'd be a lot more tasteless as a country. Now, I'm not gonna lie, egg and olive sandwiches aren't making anyone's top 3 anytime soon, but they were pretty damn good for the value. I mean, a proper sandwich that's healthy, easy to carry, takes no work at all, and is cheap. That's just a good deal, and the kind of deal that you start compromising on your standards for just a tiny bit. I'm not exactly sure why this ever fell out of favor with people. I think maybe we just moved on from olives, or the specific combination of eggs and olives. Either way, this was one of the most common things to bring. Interestingly enough, though, depending on your neighborhood, office, and job, that would be completely untrue. Egg and olive sandwiches were more so something you would see in working to middle-class offices and neighborhoods exactly because they were so practical and affordable. You could throw a slice of cheese in there and some leftover ham, and you would pretty much be set for the rest of the shift. However, having that many fried eggs daily wasn't a good idea either. People would keep this in rotation around like 2 or 3 times in a day. I'm going to throw you in for a kicker, and I'm not sure how you're going to take it. Gnocchi with butter sauce is actually something that people used to eat in the 70s. But the kicker is that the idea of gnocchi being introduced as a daily dish for Americans was a habit that was picked up during the Depression. That's right, the Depression. A gnocchi today might run you a decent amount. I mean, if you were getting enough for a meal. There's a bit of a skill barrier to making it, so it's not like many people can just whip up a batch at home either. This wasn't the case back then, because using all-purpose flour and other substitutes, people actually started to make their own homemade gnocchi for chump change, and the Italians at the time were really helpful in providing knowledge on how to make it. That's kind of why this dish could get popular in the 70s, because it already built a reputation for itself. You know? Unfortunately, you need to be a lot more than just gnocchi with butter sauce if you want to keep up with the riffraff of today. Like so many others on the list, While there's definitely potential here and the pairing makes a lot of sense, there's not enough value for the amount of time and energy that goes into it or the money you spend. Flavoring with Worcestershire sauce may sound simple today, but for Grandma it was a genius shortcut that elevated humble beef into something richer. Just a few drops added layers of flavor that made plain ground beef taste almost like a steak. The tangy, savory depth of the sauce seeped into every bite, transforming burgers, meatloaf, and skillet meals into dishes that felt more special than their modest ingredients suggested. At a time when seasoning options were limited and spice cabinets weren't as stocked as they are now, Worcestershire was a miracle in a bottle. It was affordable, versatile, and long-lasting, which made it a kitchen essential. Families grew up on meals where that little splash of sauce was the secret no one talked about but everyone tasted. It gave ground beef a boldness that kept it from feeling repetitive, even if you ate it several times a week. Today, with so many sauces and condiments available, this old trick feels almost too simple to remember, but its impact remains undeniable. It was a way of making the ordinary extraordinary, with nothing more than a quick shake of the bottle. I'm glad potato pancakes and jambalaya are next to each other, because both are some pretty fine examples of how a lot of typical American meals are influenced by the many cultures and communities that exist within the nation. Jambalaya, for instance, is a Creole and Cajun original that comes right from the heart of Louisiana. It's got a fair bit of heritage from other cuisines too, namely Spanish and French ones. Jambalaya was typically introduced to the people by French settlers who had brought on most of their recipes and ways of cooking during the very early colonial time of America, specifically Louisiana. What they didn't foresee is that one-pot culture would end up popping off so well in America, and that's exactly the mold jambalaya fit into as well. Even up in the land of the oui-oui, or as they call it, France, they would typically cook this in one pot. In Louisiana, though, in the rural patches of land surrounding the state where plantations were, it was a typical meal there since a lot of the dish was centered around rice. And that was a staple. In the 1960s, Southern cuisine, especially out of places like Louisiana, had really stretched out to other parts of the country. All of this note-taking from other people's books has a reason, by the way, and I'll get into that later. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. Now, speaking of retro, tuna jelly salad was a really vintage recipe that started coming into the spotlight around the 60s. This was the time when Jell-O and gelatin mold-based dishes were getting really popular. The idea was to use the gelatin mold to encase the tuna with a typical salad dressing, and it really worked back then. I'm not exactly sure how people would react to it now, since I think the idea of a tuna and gelatin crossover is a bit too bold for a lot of people's palates. I could always be wrong though, so you tell me, dear viewer. Would you take a tuna jelly salad to work? Or would you just make a quick run for the nearest Wendy's? I wouldn't blame you at all if you picked the second one. The idea behind salads like these was to throw a spin on an otherwise really boring format of cooking. Salads were okay, but they were never something Americans preferred with their whole hearts. Nowadays, that opinion really started to become public sentiment. Plus, as I was previously talking about, most people would opt for Starbucks now. And I'll tell you this right now, tuna, Jell-O, and caffeine do not go together. Baked ziti is still, on the other hand, something I would say does get a lot of action, even today though. Sometimes these American trends confuse the life out of me. Like, I just don't get why baked ziti would outpace shredded pork tacos, you know? It doesn't make sense. It's like saying you'd expect, I don't know, U2 to outlast Coldplay. I mean, sure, maybe I'm on the younger side when I say this, but U2 had some hits. Coldplay, though? That's kind of my outlook on the whole situation. If you think baked ziti deserves to be in the 2020s with us more than some other items on the list, feel free to disagree, and actually, disagree pretty loudly in the comments. Back to baked ziti, though. So here you have your usual pasta cheese affair, which seems to be a combination that, across all ages, Americans can't seem to get enough of. It's cheap, it's economical, and it's definitely healthy. Still, it's bland, a bit uninspiring, and, well, just overdone. This is also why you don't see most people making baked zitis outside of 30-something suburban moms. Saving bacon grease for frying beef was one of Grandma's quiet secrets for adding depth to otherwise simple meals. Whenever bacon was cooked, the fat was carefully poured into a tin or jar and kept on the counter or in the fridge. Later, when it came time to brown ground beef, she'd scoop in a spoonful, letting the smoky, savory flavor mingle with the meat. This gave even the plainest beef dishes a richness that couldn't be matched by oil or butter. It wasn't just about taste either. It was about never wasting something that could be used again. Bacon grease was considered liquid gold in many kitchens, and it flavored everything it touched. For ground beef, it was transformative, turning ordinary patties or gravies into meals that tasted indulgent. Today, we often discard bacon drippings without a thought, but back then, this was part of a cycle of cooking that made sure nothing went to waste. It's a trick that not only saved money, but also gave dishes the kind of flavor that sticks in your memory long after the meal is gone. Hobo stew is a funny one. It gets its name from the lifestyle that people were living in the Great Depression. That was a decade marked by people drifting in and out of the edge of poverty and the very rock bottom of it. Most people were working in unmaintained environments or cooking right over open fires. The stew got its name from how rustic it was and how it typically was made in places like this during this time, but it's actually named that out of endearment. People thought this stew was a sign of how they really didn't want to be done in by the Depression and how they were just struggling to get by only one more day. It was a one-pot meal that you really improvised and used a lot of hands-on ingredients instead of a dedicated shopping list, but somehow, that's exactly what the 1960s wanted. Lots of Depression and war-era dishes still stuck around, or at least their concepts did, because of how they were so adaptable to a fast-paced environment. If you ever had the time to spend doing lots of prep work and just needed to get to work as soon as possible, this is the kind of stuff you could go for. To start it off, we're going to keep it very healthy with egg salad stuffed tomatoes. This was supposed to be a really light twist on the usual egg salad, which, as far as salads went, performed really well. Now, tomatoes aren't exactly someone's first pick when it comes to eating healthy and making your food taste good. Do they work on things like pizzas and burgers? Of course, but they're always usually a background character, even in those types of dishes. Here, though, the tomato is supposed to be the star of the show. The thing is, you're eating a tomato that's been hollowed out completely and has been stuffed with egg salad. You ever seen those jalapenos that have been emptied out and stuffed with cheese or aromatics? It's kind of like that. Why did something like this ever go out of style? Well, in today's culture of waking up half an hour before your shift because you need every bit of sleep you can possibly imagine, it just doesn't make sense to have something that's so prep work heavy as your daily lunch. So Chili Mac, same deal, right? Good value, good for the time it was in, but couldn't manage to keep up. It was a desperate way for people to reinvent chili in my retrospective, but maybe you'll feel differently. Lots of people really did take to chili and macaroni, so it's not like the idea wasn't worth trying. It's just that it wasn't really all that when compared to everything else that slowly started becoming available. Chili Mac was supposed to be a mix of chili con carne and macaroni, and chili con carne was definitely having its day in the 70s, but the dish had a focus on being convenient. That was what really drew people to it. Boxed macaroni and canned chili go together like butter on toast, and it meant that this was an easy-to-prepare option you could rely on any time of the week, any time of the day. You could bake it into a one-dish meal or bring it to a potluck. It was popular enough at school cafeterias, and some Southern families really swore against everything else when it came to their lunch options. It's still beloved because you can't beat the value at that price point, but it's also something people go to because of rose-tinted glasses and nostalgia. Turning beef into breakfast hash was a clever way of making leftovers feel like a brand new meal. Instead of letting scraps of ground beef go unused, Grandma would crumble them into a skillet with diced potatoes and onions. Fried until golden and crispy, the mixture became a hearty breakfast that kept families full until lunch. This trick was about more than thrift. It was about variety, ensuring that yesterday's dinner didn't feel repetitive. Sometimes eggs were cracked on top or served alongside, making the dish even more satisfying. The sizzling smell of hash in the morning was the kind of aroma that filled kitchens with warmth and comfort. It showed that no ingredient was too small to be reinvented into something substantial. Today, we think of hash as diner food, but it was once a symbol of resourcefulness at home. It turned the act of using leftovers into an opportunity for something delicious and comforting. Now, the macaroni mass movement has also spread to other dishes and facets of American culture, like our dear old chili. Chili with pasta is something you'd see all over the 20th century, but the chili macaroni fusion had not happened properly until the middle of the 20th century. It was actually thanks to all the economic struggle that was going on at the time that people decided to work with a dish that could be adapted with macaroni like this. Since macaroni itself was extremely filling but not too strong in the taste department, and since chili had nothing to offer you but flavor and wasn't really that filling, the mix was obvious. Both the dishes had a mutually beneficial relationship to gain from working with each other, and Americans are nothing if not people who have a keen nose for opportunity, especially with food. Thanks to that, the Chili Mac combo became a massive hit throughout working-class homes across the United States. This was seen as a wonderful one-dish meal that could tend to almost every need you had while still being superbly easy to make. Which forgotten dish do you regret losing the most? Drop your answer in the comments, hit like and subscribe so we can keep bringing back the old-school flavors that truly deserve to be remembered.